Hey, everybody, welcome to Module 3. We're going to talk more about poetry writing this week. Now, as we get started talking about writing poetry, I want to begin with how do you read poetry? Some of you may be already deeply into the world of poetry and you may have your own way of approaching reading it. Maybe you had a strong English teacher who taught you a lot about how to read poetry, but maybe some of you feel like it's still really hard to know how to approach a poem and what to do with it once it's in front of us and we have to read it. So, before we talk about writing poetry and the elements of poetry, I want to talk about just how to read a poem. I'm going to pare it down to something just really simple, okay? When you're looking at a poem, that poem is creating a whole world for you right there in a small space on the page, okay? And it's a very small container. It's like a window into a world for just a short period of time. It's going to give you a scene, an event, an image, an idea, something in just a blip on the page. Now, obviously, some poems go on for pages, they're whole odysseys and stories. Some poems are just tiny, tiny with just a few lines. But the goal of all of them is to create a world for you. Now, when I approach a poem, my first thought is okay, I have to figure out what that world is. And sometimes that takes a couple readings. So, what I do is I read the poem the first time through to see it because poetry is visual. It's a visual art, it's an art on the page. So, the way that it looks on the page and also the vision of the world that it's giving me, it all has to do with visual. Okay, I have to see it. So on my first reading through, I'm trying to see, okay? Then I read the poem again, and the second time I read it to hear it because there's also a lot of auditory uh, aspects to a poem as well. Sometimes I'll read it out loud if I'm having a particularly hard time, but there's a lot of sound aspects that go into poems as well. So whenever you read a poem, maybe think about that. Think about, okay, what world am I getting into here? I'm going to read it once to see it, and then I'm going to read it once to hear it. And then a lot of times I'll have to read a poem many more times to fully understand what's happening there. But that's the way that I approach the reading of poetry. Now, this week, what we're going to do is we're going to look specifically at three models. I've given you a reading assignment from your text, and it's over the course of quite a few pages. So make sure you do that. But in this video, I'm just going to highlight some of the main points from that reading, give you kind of like a big picture, rapid fire summary of the information. This does not substitute for reading the text, so make sure that you read the text as well. Okay. I want you to start before I go into deeper into the video. I want you to start by reading three poems. If you haven't done it already, I want you to read My Personal Recollections of Not Being Asked to the Prom by Gail White. That one, if you're using the print form of the book, that's going to be on pages 20 and 21. If you're using the ebook, I believe it's page 72, but you know how ebooks are and page numbering. You may just have to look it up in the index to find it, but I believe it's page 72 in the ebook. And then I want you to read Fourth Grade Autobiography by Donica Kelly, and that is pages 21 and 22 in the print book, page 74, I think, in the ebook. And then I want you to read Duration by Ray Armentrout, and that is on page 22 and 23 in the print, and that is page 76 in the ebook. So stop the video, go do that. Even if you've read it before, maybe go read it again now after what I said before about reading first to see it, then to hear it, and then come back. Okay, hopefully, you took some time to step away and read those poems because as I go through each of the elements of poetry, I'm going to be referring back to each one, but I'm not going to read the whole thing. So I'm going to be pulling examples from each one. And so hopefully they're fresh in your mind so that you can kind of see and hear the examples in context. So the first element of poetry I want to talk about is lines. This is the very beginning, what we start with. We build a poem with lines. The definition of lines in poetry is that they're just the basic unit of a poem, and they are intentional choices. Each line can contain a full sentence, or it contain a phrase, or it can contain just a single word. So when we look at this in practice, we see in Gail White's poem, My Personal Recollections of Not Being Asked to the Prom, we see that the lines are often not complete sentences and they're cleverly broken for emphasis. I think this is one of my favorite things about poetry is when people break sentences up and have them be on separate lines so that I see individual things about that idea, that world that's being built for me that maybe I wouldn't see otherwise if the line was broken differently. So look at these three lines from the Gail White poem. I never minded my unpopularity in those days. Books were friend and poets dead were lovers. Brainy girls were still a rarity. So the line breaks give us some indication of what we need to see, what we really need to notice. In Armentrout's poems, the lines are often short, fragmented, or elliptical, inviting reflection. So let's look at this example. We're still on the air, they say. Now notice the white space there is almost doing as much work as the space with the lines. Now, in our book, at the end of each section, you're going to see that there's a checklist, and the checklist kind of covers the topic of the section. So if you look at page 29 in the print version, you'll see the checklist for lines and stanzas, and you'll see I really like it. I have my little note here to make sure I point this checklist out. I want you to notice all the checklists because they're there to help you really go back to your writing and ask yourself questions that are really helpful to see if your writing is as strong as it could be about each of those topics. So you'll see on the checklist it says, "Do your line endings make sense?" I want you to refer to these checklists a lot. And as I go through this video today, I'm going to be giving you a little summary of checklist advice for each of the topics. The checklist advice for lines is to always choose your line breaks intentionally, avoid breaking your lines randomly, especially if you're breaking them on weak words. Next, we're going to talk about stanzas. Now, the definition of a stanza in poetry is that it is a group of lines set apart by spaces. They organize poems thematically or rhythmically. Now, what does this look like in practice? When we look at Donica Kelly's whole poem, it's just one stanza. So we get the feel that she is pouring out the story all in one big kind of dump. Okay, maybe dump isn't a great word because I love that poem so much, but it all comes quick and there's no pausing. And if you know the story behind that poem, you can see why. Now, when we look at Armentrout, the stanzas are actually meant to be more isolationary. They isolate images or thoughts. They slow us down and they make us see what we're supposed to see in just those tiny little pieces of text. Here's an example. Those flurries of small pecks my mother called leaky faucet kisses. I love that image. Now, checklist advice for stanzas. Use stanza breaks to signal shifts in mood, topic, or voice. They help your reader pause and they help them uh, feel where they're supposed to stop and notice. All right, next let's talk about meter. I told you this is going to be rapid fire, so I'm trying to move it along. I know we've all got lives to live, so I don't want to bog you down too much, but let's keep going. Meter. Meter is the patterned arrangement of stressed and unstressed syllables. Not all contemporary poems use meter. Now, meter is that thing that you kind of typically attribute to poetry. Ta-da, 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 ta-da. Okay? That's meter. Now, in practice, the three poems we're looking at, Gail White's work sometimes leans on regular meter. You hear it in the poem we read this week, or today, hopefully this week, today, whenever you read it. Um, and it echoes conversational rhythm, but much of it is irregular. So let's read this section and hear it out loud. We live in Los Angeles, California. We have a front yard and a backyard. My favorite things are cartwheels, salted plums, and playing catch with my dad. I squeeze the grass and dirt between my fingers, eat my tongue white. He launches every ball into orbit. Now you can hear just a little bit of that ta-da, 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 but it's irregular. So sometimes we use it in a way that's regular and sometimes irregular. Armentrout and Kelly, they both tend to forego the regular meter in favor of free verse. And so you saw that in both of the poems that you read. Checklist advice when it comes to meter. If you're not writing in formal meter, your syllable count can help you maintain rhythmic consistency. So you kind of see that in the example here. It's irregular, but there's this pacing and kind of count of syllables that keeps the meter moving along in a way that we kind of can follow and know what to expect. All right, very closely related to meter is rhythm. The definition of rhythm refers to the overall pattern of sound, pace, and movement. Even free verse has rhythm. It's shaped by line length, punctuation, and word choice. In duration, though not metrical, we see a distinctive clipped rhythm. Here are a few lines from that poem so you can see that. Silver whistles of blackbirds needle the day long day. So, though not metrical, you can hear a rhythm there. You fall into a rhythm when you read poetry. If you read poetry aloud, especially, you can hear yourself falling into a rhythm. I'm going to include some videos this week of people reading poetry, at least one person reading poetry, that helps you. The more you listen to a poetry reader or writer reading their own work, the more you start to learn how the rhythm is supposed to sound. But you have to hear it a few times. Now, in Kelly's poem, it reads almost like prose, but you can feel that there's like this thud of a pause on this really hard truth that kind of permeates that whole poem. In that poem, we learn that this girl was abused. And I want you to hear how that kind of lands in this section. The sunset of flames ringing our block, groceries and Asian-owned storefronts. No one to catch me. Midnight walks from his room to mine. I believe in the devil. And that's the moment where we know what's happening to her on those midnight walks, right? So, checklist advice for rhythm: read your work aloud. Read other people's work aloud so that you can hear what the rhythm and the flow and the pacing of the poem should be. Music. Now, again, we're very much in those sound elements that I was talking about here. The definition of music in poetry refers to the sonic qualities like rhyme, repetition, alliteration, and assonance. So, okay, all of those different things are very deeply explored in your text. So make sure you spend some time with that. Again, this is a high level, rapid fire overview of the elements of poetry today. So I'm just giving you the basics. In practice, in Gail White's prom poem, we hear music in the rhyme or the repetition. So here, I'll read you this little section where you can kind of hear rhyme and repetition for musicality. We're going to start in the middle of a sentence because that's where the line starts. So you can look back at the poem and kind of see where we're coming from if you want to. And saucy wits, I look back now with pity on the young me I didn't pity then. I didn't know I was almost pretty and might have had a charm for older men. What I really like about that is that it has rhyme, but it's not sing-songy, because that's the thing about rhyme. It strays into being sing-songy so easily. So, rhyme is something, though often attributed to poetry as the thing that makes it poetry, it's also the thing that can ruin poetry and has to be wielded really carefully. So, Armentrout, on the other hand, uses kind of subtle sound echoes. And if you read the Armentrout poem over, read it out loud, listening for the sound of the K's and the S's, especially. You'll hear those sounds echoed throughout. So, as far as advice, listen for how the poem sounds. Music isn't always limited to rhyme, it's also limited to sound repetition and all these other things we're talking about. So, on to images. Now we're talking about more about what we see, how a poem looks. The definition of imagery is the use of vivid, concrete sensory details, something the reader can see, hear, taste, touch, or smell. In practice, we see that in Kelly's poem, it often includes striking physical details from childhood. Here's a line that really stands out to me. Every ball drops like an anvil, heavy. I feel like that really lends to the overall dark tone and heavy tone of the poem. Just that image creates that. Armentrout, on the other hand, uses images that fragment reality and kind of make us wonder, wait a second, what am I looking at here? Where am I? Beyond the neighbor's tree in heaven. Now, that's just one stanza. Now, you know that in heaven leads to the next stanza, so we see where we're going, but we kind of move around in the imagery with her. White is direct and relatable in her imagery. Here's an example. And my poor mom, who never bought a fluffy ball gown or showed me how to dress my hair. The specifics of that imagery take us right into the world of the poem. Some advice for writing your own poems: replace abstractions with specific details. It's the old writing adage, show, don't tell. And the example up here of White and talking about her mom and the specifics of what her mom didn't get to do in buying a fluffy ball gown or showing her how to dress her hair, those specifics really ground us in the world of the poem. Okay, on to symbols. Symbols are images or items that represent larger ideas or themes. So, in the poems we've just read, in White's poem, the prom acts as a symbol of social belonging that White never particularly needed. She didn't need to be a kid who went to the prom. In Kelly's poem, childhood objects and scenes seem to indicate innocence, but abuse and that dark, heavy feeling is insinuated throughout the poem. For your own poems, consider what images or actions might mean beyond their literal existence. What can they symbolize? On to figurative language. Figurative language includes metaphor, simile, personification, any imaginative comparison or extension of meaning. And again, your text dives so deeply into these different elements and their sub-elements. I love Dr. Starkey's. He is a poet, very well-known poet here in California, up in the Santa Barbara area. He was like the poet laureate of Santa Barbara, I think, at one point, and he's well known in the community for that. And he dives really deeply into all of these because this really is his first love. So you can see that in the text. Spend some time with that. In practice, we see that Kelly uses metaphors to contemplate nature. Here's an example. We lie in the grass and wonder who writes in the sky. I lie in the grass and imagine my name, a cloud drifting, Saturday. Now, does somebody actually write in the sky? No, no, they don't. But that's figurative language. White's humor rests in carefully chosen comparisons. So here again, we start in this example in the middle of a line or in the middle of a sentence because the line begins in the middle of the sentence. Notice how she does that. were lovers, brainy girls were still a rarity, and boys preferred big bosoms to well-read and saucy wits. I look back now with pity. So we see the humor of, someone older looking back and maybe understanding things a little bit better based on experience. Advice for you when you're writing your poems: substitute cliches. Make sure that you're getting rid of cliches and using fresh, original, figurative language when you create your work. Diction. Okay, diction is word choice. Formal, informal, simple, complex, archaic, contemporary. You make the choice. But the tendency for a lot of people is to want to use formal and kind of complex and archaic language because they think poetry is very serious and it needs to be something that we have a higher level of diction when we create it. But that's not true because you remember last week you read Lindsay Rush and saw a very real world language in that poem, and then you see it in the work this week too. So Armentrout often uses concise modern language. White mixes conversational diction with sly humor, and Kelly's diction is uncluttered and evocative. So choices in diction are important, and sometimes they're much more varied than what we think we have. So um, diction can be all the way from very simple all the way to very complex. Advice for your work: words should fit your intent and your audience. Avoid outdated terms unless it's necessary for what you want to create with the effect of your poem. All right, syntax, also related to diction. How words and phrases are arranged, your sentence structure, your line arrangement, the order you put things in really affects the message that you're giving. In practice, Armentrout frequently fragments syntax, breaking conventional order. Kelly follows clear syntax for clarity, and White plays with syntactic rhythm for a wry effect. So, playing with where things are can really change up the world that you're creating in your poem. Advice for you as the poet: experiment, but make your choices intentional. Syntax affects clarity, voice, and pacing. It's kind of a big deal. All right. So, just a quick review: how the elements of poetry compare and work together. Lines and stanzas are structural. Meter, rhythm, and music relate to sound. Images, symbols, figurative language build meaning and mood, and diction and syntax shape voice and clarity. Let's look at that a little bit closer. Meter is about pattern, rhythm is about flow, and music is about sound. Images paint pictures. Symbols deepen those pictures with extra meaning, and figurative language transforms or compares those pictures. Diction is choice of words. Syntax is choice of arrangement. Now, how to identify and use the elements. This may seem like a lot of information that I've just thrown at you, and I tried to do it in as rapid fire fashion as I could because this video is already over 23 minutes long, and I want to keep things as concise for you as I can. So, what do you do with this? If you're feeling like you need to really hone in, use the checklists in the text as reading and writing tools. Again, they're at the end of every section based on the topic for that session. Now, when you're reading a poem, ask yourself, what is this world that's being created here? What does each line and stanza do? What rhythms and patterns do I hear? What images stand out? What symbols might be present? When you're writing your own work, ask yourself, what world am I creating here for my reader? Are my line breaks intentional? Is my voice clear? Am I using specific images and fresh comparisons? This is a great place to start. If nothing else, just save this slide right here, and this is where you can get started. I hope this was helpful. Go ahead and take whatever notes, back up in the video if you need to, go over it again. Make sure you don't miss the reading for this week, and let me know if you have any questions via the inbox.